Finally, it's a poem that ends with one of the most misquoted lines in English literature. The phrase, "all that glitters is not gold," has long since replaced the original "all that glisters is not gold," used by Thomas Gray in his humorous poem Ode on the Death of a Favourite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes. But what is the origin of the much-loved and anthologised poem? Is it pure invention? Well, as it happens, it's not. As Sir Christopher Frayling, Professor of Cultural History at the Royal College of Art in London and frequent TV presenter, told me on a recent trip to the Long Room Hub in Trinity College. He began by reading the poem's introduction.
"'Twas on a lofty vase's side, where China's gayest art had dyed the azure flowers that blow, demurest of the tabby kind, the pensive Selima reclined, gazed on the lake below. Her conscious tale her joy declared, the fair round face, the snowy beard, the velvet of her paws, her coat that with the tortoise vies, her ears of jet and emerald eyes. She saw and purred applause."
We will come back to the poem and tell the story of what happened to Selima as we go on. But tell us first of all, who was Horace Walpole?
Horace Walpole was the youngest son of Britain's first ever Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who ruled fairly continuously between the 1720s and the 1740s, and grew up in a fairly privileged environment. In fact, his father arranged for him a pension or sinecure for life, so he didn't really have to work very hard. And he was also MP for a constituency in Cornwall where he never ever set foot in his life, but that's what politics was like in the 18th century. And he opinions differ about his significance. Political and economic historians think of him as a rather flamboyant, superficial figure who spent his life writing gossipy letters and designing things and writing art history and getting involved in sort of the aesthetic realm. Whereas others now see him as an extremely important figure, partly for the insight he gives us into the 18th century. I mean, there's 4,000 letters he left, and that's just the surviving ones. He wrote endlessly correspondence, kept copies of them. He hoped one day they'd be published. Yeah? So 4,000 letters, plus his books, plus the house that he remodelled at Strawberry Hill, South London, Twickenham, which is the first of the Gothic revival architecture. I mean, all those Victorian town halls and churches and big public buildings in the Gothic style all start with Strawberry Hill. So from the visual, artistic, courtly point of view, Horace Walpole is very, very important, but not from the sort of straightforward political and economic history. Old-style history sees him as a disappointment to his dad.
From the literary point of view, he's very significant as well, because he's thought of as being the first great Gothic novelist.
Yes, he wrote a novel called The Castle of Otranto, which he wrote, I think, very quickly. He finished remodelling his house at Strawberry Hill, and one of the features of Strawberry Hill is this hall with this winding stairway with heraldic beasts stuck onto all the banisters. It's very spooky, very medievally. You know, you expect cobwebs and mist and people in cloaks wandering around. And Horace Walpole one night had a dream about this hallway, and he dreamed that a giant hand in armour was resting, unattached to an arm, resting on the upper banister. And he got up that morning, and an awful lot of Gothic stories begin with dreams. You know, Bram Stoker's Dracula began with a dream. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde began with a dream. So he sat down, frantically wrote down the dream, and that was the centrepiece of the Castle of Otranto. It came out in the 1760s, and was first of all under a pseudonym. He called himself Muralto, which is high wall, Walpole. I mean, I don't think anyone was fooled, but then the second edition came out. He acknowledged that he'd written it. He wrote an introduction explaining the circumstances of its gestation, and it launched the whole craze for Gothic novels. Novels set in medievally settings, ghosts, cobwebby castles, melodramatic emotions, much put upon heroines, banditti, wild landscapes. All of that begins with the Castle of Otranto. So although he was very light about it, I mean, in his letters he tends to dismiss the book as a kind of mere squib. Actually, it's one of the most important novels in English literature. I mean, like the Gothic novel or not, it launched a torrent, and we're still living with it.
Yes, despite the fact that he was important from that point of view, he's perhaps less well known in the 21st century than his cat, because of this poem, this wonderful poem written by Thomas Gray. Just tell us a little bit about the house in which Selima would have lived with Horace Walpole, and the Chinese vase into which Selima fell.
Yes. before he moved full-time to Strawberry Hill, while he was remodelling the house, he lived in a townhouse at Arlington Street, St James's, London, which he inherited from his father. He got the lease from his father when his father died. And Arlington Street was a very, very upmarket street in those days, where most ministers of the Crown lived on one side of the street, and when they fell from office, they moved to the other side, the cheaper side of the street. And as Walpole said, he lived on the cheaper side of the street because Robert Walpole had fallen from grace. And number 5, Arlington Street, still there with a plaque on the wall. And it was inside Arlington Street, late 17th, early 18th century building, that he kept his cat, and he kept a prized possession, which was a piece of blue and white Chinese porcelain, a large tub. Now, you've got to understand that in the early 18th century, there was a huge craze for Chinese design. Blue and white porcelain, pagodas in the garden, China tea, which no one had heard of 200 years before, but was already almost the national beverage, and was taking over from, if you think of what was the national beverage in England in the 18th century, you think Hogarth, beer, gin. China tea was beginning to take over from beer and gin in the 1730s, 1740s. So China was it, and at that stage in his life, Horace Walpole was very into Chinese design. So you've got this Chinese tub in his living room in Arlington Street. His cat Selima, who was named, this gets complicated, who was named after a character in a play that Walpole had something to do with, all about Tamburlaine the Great. The princess was called Selima, the fragrant feline princess. So he calls his cat Selima. This tabby cat perches on the side of this tub, and Horace Walpole kept goldfish in it. Goldfish also a very recent craze, very luxurious, very expensive, very, very upmarket. Probably koi carp, big ones, not little goldfish. Big. So you've got these big goldfish swimming around inside this Chinese porcelain tub. You've got this tabby cat perched on the edge of the tub in the living room of Arlington Street, and the cat falls in. And Walpole comes down, and the cat is floating deceased. So he immediately writes to his friend from schoolboy days, they were at Eton together, Thomas Gray, the poet, "Will you write me an epitaph for Selima the cat?" There was a minor craze for writing silly poems about animals at the time. And Thomas Gray came up with this poem, Ode on the Death of a Favourite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes.
OK, we'll save the best to last, the last couple of verses to last, but just continue the story as Gray tells it.
Still had she gazed, but midst the tide 2 angel forms were seen to glide, the genii of the stream. Their scaly armour's Tyrian hue, through richest purple to the view, betrayed a golden gleam. The hapless nymph with wonder saw a whisker first and then a claw, with many an ardent wish. She stretched in vain to reach the prize. What female heart can gold despise? What cat's averse to fish?
Now, Gray is obviously well known because of his poem Elegy written in a country churchyard. Tell us about something about the relationship between Walpole and Gray.
Walpole and Gray were rather bookish friends at Eton. In fact, another ode that Gray wrote at the time of the Elegy in an English country churchyard was an ode to a prospect of Eton College. So they're schoolboys together at Eton. They go to Cambridge together. Walpole doesn't finish his degree. In common with a lot of aristocratic children, he sort of gave up, but was bright enough, but he didn't bother. Gray was very studious and eventually became a fellow at Cambridge. They go on the grand tour together, again, part of the 18th century thing after Cambridge or Oxford was to complete your education by going particularly to France and Italy, particularly Paris and Rome. And Thomas Gray can't afford it. He comes from a much more impoverished background than Horace Walpole, the son of basically a minor league investment banker. Now there's a name to conjure with. And he's a little bit chippy about this. Thomas Gray is sort of rather socially uneasy, particularly when Horace Walpole kept reminding him of what a prole he was, Anyway, Walpole pays for Thomas Gray to come on the tour with him. They started arguing in Calais, and in Reggio in Italy they have a terrible row about something, no one's sure what. It might have been a lover's tiff, it might have been all sorts of things, but they go their separate ways, and in fact they don't speak to each other for several years. The reconciliation between them takes place in Arlington Street, St James's, shortly before the cat poem, and I think Thomas Gray agreed to write the poem and tried so hard to make it impressive as his way back into Horace Walpole's affections. They've fallen out. He wants Walpole to like him. So it's absolutely full of things he knows Horace Walpole will enjoy. References to obscure poets, references to classical literature, Milton, Pope, Dryden, John Gay, classical myths about dolphins, Aesop's fables, you name it. I mean, you could do a sort of footnoted edition of this poem where every line would have a reference to an obscure poem. He knew Walpole would get all the references and have that warm glow of satisfaction of, I understand this poem completely. It was Gray's way back into his friend's affections. So it's very important to him, this poem.
It's also important in terms of cat history, or the history of the cat.
Yes.
And, for example, the expression tabby.
Yes, up until this poem was published, the word tabby, for example, in Dr. Johnson's dictionary, the primary definition of tabby is a kind of fabric, taffeta or silk, originating from Baghdad. And so, if you said tabby, people would immediately think it's a garment, an outfit, a piece of fabric. After the poem, it's indelibly associated with cats. The stripes on the back of a cat, a tabby cat. Just like the word demurest of the tabby kind, the word, for some reason, demure gets associated with cats, so that Lewis Carroll, in Alice Through the Looking Glass, right at the beginning, the kitty sat demurely on her knee. Somehow it's the right word to use for cats. So this poem actually alters the English language in a way. It's... there's something slightly sort of camp about it, and slightly arch, obviously, spending so much trouble writing a poem about a cat, as someone's just said after the lecture, why take all this trouble about dumb animals? But I think Horace Walpole got on better with animals than he did with human beings, and surrounded himself by little yappy dogs and tabby cats and different kinds of cats. And Thomas Gray also was a rather reclusive, diffident character that wasn't a socialite at all. And in a funny way, they shared this fantasy world involving animals, as sometimes happens, and the poem is a monument to that.
Well, thank you very much for opening up the history of this poem and elucidating something of the history of the tabby cat. And perhaps, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Sir Christopher Frayling. Perhaps you could conclude with the sad story.
Presumptuous maid with looks intent, again she stretched, again she bent, nor knew the gulf between. Malignant fate sat by and smiled, the slippery verge her feet beguiled. She tumbled headlong in. 8 times emerging from the flood, she mewed to every watery god, some speedy aid to send. No dolphin came, no Nereid stirred, nor cruel Tom nor Susan heard. A favourite has no friend. From undeceived, no, one false step is ne'er retrieved, and be with caution bold. Not all that tempts your wandering eyes and heedless hearts is lawful prize, nor all that glisters gold.